Hey friends, Durosai here. Hope you guys are doing well and staying creative. So this is going to be the first video in a series that I'm doing about room acoustics and how to set up your home studio. So in this episode, I'll be talking about how and where to set up your studio monitors as well as your mix position. And in the next episode, I'll be going through acoustic treatment, talking about what different types of treatment to use and where to put them. So if you want to get notified about that, please hit the little subscribe button down below along with the notification bell. So for my day job, I'm actually an acoustic engineer. I primarily design high multi-channel count private cinemas as well as some 2-channel listening rooms. And I'm really fortunate that a lot of these rooms that I design are extremely high performance, multi-million-dollar rooms. So I really get to push the boundaries of acoustic engineering and what's possible with today's science and technology. But I want to trickle down the information and experience that I've gained designing high performance rooms and apply that to studios on a budget, so you can get the best performance with the resources that you have. So let's get into it. Alright, so I figured instead of me trying to awkwardly hold my camera and point things out in my room, it'd be easier for me to just model this in a 3D CAD software. So that's what I did here. I modeled this in a program called Vectorworks, which is what I use for my job. So I'll show you everything in the virtual world. So if you're in a small room like I am, chances are there's probably not a whole lot of places that you can have your setup in the first place. So in my room, I have a couple limitations. Like I have this door right here. There's a door. I have a closet over here. Got this window, and then I have this slanted ceiling. These are all features of the room that will affect my decision-making process when it comes to where to put my studio monitors and all that stuff. So it's also a pretty square room with one dimension being slightly longer than the other, 12 by 11. The ceiling height, I can check it out right now. Obviously it's a little bit different at the back half of the room versus the front half. Yeah, we got about a 9'4" ceiling. Apologies to everybody that's not in the US. Yes, I am on the imperial system, not the metric system, because this is America. Okay, so in a small room, or really in almost any room, bass is going to be one of the hardest things to get right. So with low frequencies, you get something called room modes. These are resonances that the room excites that are related to the dimensions of your room. You'll experience things like standing waves and phase cancellation. So if you've ever walked around your room while playing some music with bass in it, you've probably noticed that certain parts of your room have a lot of bass, other parts of your room have almost no bass, and some parts of your room have just the right amount of bass. So the frequencies at which these nulls and peaks in the response happen are based on the room dimensions, and they correlate with the wavelengths of the sound. And these room modes will play an effect on your bass response up until a point called the Schroeder frequency. This is essentially a transitional frequency above which the wavelengths of the frequencies are much smaller than your room dimensions, and so the room modes don't play as much of an effect, and instead you'll get things like comb filtering. But sound frequencies above the Schroeder frequency are much easier to deal with using acoustic treatment. But it's hard to get a really good bass response without proper trapping and like insulating your walls and all that. But anyway, I digress. I'll get more into that in the next video. But outside of treatment, you can still implement certain things to get the most out of your situation. So here are some rules of thumb, some guidelines that you can use to start placing your setup. Now remember, these are just guidelines that usually provide a good result, but not 100% of the time, as every room is different and there's a lot of variables involved, but this is a good starting point. So rule of thumb number one, is to have your monitors firing down the longer dimension of the room. And so this is for two reasons. One is because to make the reflections off the back wall less prominent. So the farther your back wall is away from you, the more the sound is going to be attenuated as it reflects off this wall. So if your wall is literally, if you're right up against that rear wall, you're going to hear those reflections, and that's going to color the sound. It's going to screw up with your imaging, all that. So it's best to have that wall as far away from you as possible. The second reason is that the bass waves, the low frequency waves, get more space to propagate. So, low frequency waves have a very long wavelength. And so the more space you give them, the better they can actually form their full wavefront. Obviously, even in a 12-foot room like this, a lot of frequencies still aren't going to get, the full length they need to fully propagate, which is, to be expected. If you talk about like a 20 hertz wave, I don't know the exact wavelength off the top of my head, but it's probably like 50 feet or maybe even more. Can't remember, but yeah, you want to give it as much space as possible. So the second rule of thumb is to place your mix position roughly 38% of the room length from the front wall. So in my particular room that is 12 feet long, that corresponds to about 4.5 feet. I've done the math right here, 12 times 0.38, 4.5. And the reason behind this is because typically you experience a pretty sharp dip in the bass response at the halfway point, or at least in the first axial room mode. And I'll put a link in the description if you want to read more about axial versus tangential versus oblique room modes. But just for the simplicity, yeah, so you experience a null in the bass response at the halfway point, and then at the 25% mark, you typically experience a peak in your bass response. So if you're right in between that, which is technically 37.5%, but we can round it up to 38, you're in between the peak and the null, so it's going to be a little bit smoother. Now, this doesn't necessarily apply to every single room because there are other variables such as wall composition. So in my room, I have a exterior wall right here, which exterior is going to be concrete, and then my rear wall is an interior wall, so it's just a normal stud wall with some drywall, and that's going to affect that my mix position as well. So for me, if I measure out my distance in the room, I'm about 3'4", and actually this is a little bit older, so I've moved my mix position back actually just a little bit. So currently I'm about 4 feet away from the wall, so it's a little bit less than 38, but again, it's a little bit room dependent. So another thing that's probably affecting that is that I have a window right here, I have a door here. So the window and door are essentially just acting like open spaces when it comes to low frequencies, because the width of this window and the width of this door is just so small compared to the wavelength that we're dealing with, that bass just travels right out this window, travels right out this door. So that's definitely going to affect my bass response as well. So it's a good starting point to start at that 38% mark, but try moving your mix position forward and backward and see what that gives you. You can definitely make a huge difference just by moving even 6 inches forward or 6 inches back. So, that's why I had it originally at this 3'4" mark, but just moving it 8 inches back smoothened out some of my, that first axial room mode for me quite a bit. So definitely experiment with that. So the next guideline is to place your monitors as close to your front wall as possible. And this is to minimize the phase difference between the direct low frequency sound coming from your speaker and the reflected low frequency sound that's bouncing off of this front wall. So the most ideal scenario would be if you could flush mount your speakers, or soffit mount, which means you're mounting them into the wall itself, essentially removing that front wall boundary reflection. But of course, this requires a high budget. That's why you'll see this in higher end studios, and also it's going to eat up a lot of your room real estate. So for us plebs who have to have our speakers within the room, this is the next best option, is just have them close to the wall. So for my speakers, I have my speaker drivers about 1 foot from the wall. So the reflected sound has to travel an extra 2 feet compared to the direct sound. So if we want to measure the phase difference between these two sounds, we can do that real quick. Get a little nerdy here with some math. So let's just take a 50 hertz wave, for example. So to calculate the wavelength of a 50 hertz wave, we'll divide 1 by 50, because 50 cycles per second, so 1 second divided by 50. That gives us 0.02 seconds per cycle. Now we can multiply that by 1100, which is the speed of sound roughly in feet per second. So that's going to give us 22 feet. So that's about the wavelength of a 50 hertz wave. Now, if we think about the reflected sound, it has to travel an extra 2 feet. 2 compared to 22, it's not very big. So we can do 2 divided by 22. And then we can multiply that by 360, which is the total amount of degrees in one cycle. And that's about 32 degrees. So the reflected sound is going to be about 32 degrees out of phase compared to the direct sound. And while that's not ideal, of course, it could be a lot worse. So if we had our speakers about 2 feet from the wall, then we're going to deal with, it's going to be about 60 degrees out of phase. And so 180 degrees out of phase is a complete cancellation. So because the reflected sound is going to be relatively in phase with the direct sound, you are going to get a bass boost from this front wall. So most monitors have some sort of trim control on the back, just some high frequency and low frequency trim. So I'd recommend just bumping down the bass about 2 or 4 dB just to compensate for the bass boost resulting from this front wall. Another thing you want to take into consideration is whether your speakers are front ported or rear ported. So my Atom T5Es are rear ported. You can't see that in here because I haven't modeled it. But in the low budget price range, the KRKs have a front port. Kali Audio speakers have a front port. I believe the Yamaha HS series has a rear port. But essentially, with that port, you want to make sure it has adequate airflow. So the port is typically extending the low frequency response of your speaker and allowing the speaker to reproduce more bass. So if you're blocking that airflow, it's not going to be able to reproduce the low frequencies. So in my room, I have the port about 5 inches from any boundary, which is enough space for it to function properly. You just don't want something completely obstructing the port and not allowing the adequate airflow, then it needs to function properly. So there is a scenario where you can bring your speakers farther from your front wall, and that is if you can maintain a large enough distance between the speakers and that front wall. So if you can maintain a distance of 3 or 4 or more feet from that front wall, then the reflected sound has to travel quite a bit of distance, so it is going to get somewhat attenuated by the time it hits your ears compared to the direct sound. However, an issue you might run into is that when you do place your monitors, say 4 feet from the wall, that might put your mix position at the halfway point in the room, which then, like I mentioned earlier, that's probably going to put you at a null in the frequency response for your bass. So of course, that's not a good thing. So if you do have that kind of space in your room, experiment with having your monitors close up, having your monitors farther away, and see what works best for you. So while we're on this topic of speaker placement, another thing you want to do is toe your speakers in so they're angled towards you. So some people like to have their speakers aimed a little bit behind them, so like a foot or 2 behind their head. Others have it aimed directly towards their ears. The way I have mine actually set up, it's in the model I have it aimed right to my ears, but in my room they're aimed more like a couple inches behind my head. And this really comes down to personal preference and the type of speaker that you're using. So different speakers have different dispersion characteristics, so you're going to get a different response based on how you angle them. So again, like I'll say a million times this video, experiment with different options for your toe-in angle. So experimenting is very crucial. If there was a one rule fits all type of thing for this stuff, then you wouldn't need acoustic engineers. But again, this is an iterative process, and there's so many variables when it comes down to it. So the only way to know which works best is to try out a bunch of different options. So yeah. Now when it comes to placing the height of your speakers, you want to make sure that the tweeter, or at least the point between your tweeter and woofer, is at ear height. This is pretty self-explanatory. Obviously, if a speaker is down here, it's not as good. It's not going to sound as good. Or if your speaker is up here, also not going to sound as good. essentially you're going to be losing out on a lot of the high frequency content. So it's very important to make sure that the speakers are at your ear level. So something that is pretty important is to make sure that your left and right speakers are symmetric with respect to your sidewalls. You don't want your left speaker having a different boundary condition than your right speaker, because then they're going to both experience different frequency responses, and that's going to affect the quality of your image. Another thing is, if you can, try to make sure that the distance from your speaker to the sidewall, and then the distance from the speaker to the front wall, and the distance from the speaker to the floor are all three different distances. That way you're not reinforcing the same frequencies in the modal behavior of your room. So when it comes to how far apart you should place your speakers, the general consensus is to maintain a 60-degree angular separation between your left and the right monitor, essentially forming an equilateral triangle between you, the monitor, and between both the monitors. So the farther apart you have your speakers, you're going to have more stereo width, which might be desirable, but you are going to deteriorate more of the center phantom image. So just be wary of that. And of course, the closer in you bring your speakers, the less stereo width you have, but your mono image is going to be tighter. So with my speakers, I have a little bit under 70 degrees of angular separation. I can't actually get my speakers any closer together because I have a desk here, and that gets in the way of my speaker stand. So the only option is for me to move back a little bit. But honestly, I really like the 70-degree stereo width that I'm getting, and I still have a pretty tight mono image because I have good acoustic treatment in front of my monitors. So a little recap with my room. I have my monitors firing down the longer dimension of the room, and the reason I have mine on this side of the room and not this side was because I have this slanted ceiling. So this gives me two benefits. One is that it distributes the room modes along a continually increasing dimension. So like I had mentioned previously, room modes are related to the dimensions of your room. So here in this front half of the room, the ceiling height is variable along this area. So the resonances that build up are going to be at different frequencies, and what that's going to do is it's going to broaden out some of those nulls and peaks in my bass response, and it's not going to be so sharp. And so that's a little bit easier to deal with, especially with some room EQ. The sort of worst case scenario you can have is a perfectly cube room with the height, width, and length being the exact same dimension, because all the frequencies that the resonant frequencies are all going to be essentially the same. So you're going to get very sharp peaks and nulls, and that is just a nightmare scenario. So if you're in a cube room, I feel sorry for you. You're just going to need a move or get some insane bass traps. That's my advice to you. So another advantage of having the slanted ceiling is that it's going to reflect sound away from me. So as the speaker propagates sound, some of it is going to go up into the ceiling, and because it's slanted, it's going to reflect it to the back of the room. So my monitors, of course, I had mentioned earlier, they have a slightly different boundary condition because of this window, but the ceiling, the advantage of the ceiling was enough for me to put my setup here, because it was either have a flat ceiling and the same boundary condition, or have the slanted ceiling and have this window, and the slanted ceiling won that competition. So anyway, I hope this video is really helpful for you guys to set up the monitors in your own studio. I'm trying to make these videos very comprehensive so you can apply your own discretion when it comes to these sort of things. I've seen a lot of articles and videos on the internet that tell you to do certain things, but they don't really tell you the reasoning why, and I think that's a really important part of all this, because with these rooms, every room is different. There's so many variables, so it's hard to apply just a blanket statement. So if you know the reasoning behind some of those principles that I'm talking about, then you can apply it in the best way that fits the environment that you're in. So next video is going to cover acoustic treatment. hit that subscribe button and notification bell to get notified about that if you haven't already. And as always, stay groovy, my friends. Peace out, and I'll catch you in the next video. See ya.